There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the face of kindness. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't slam doors. It simply arranges things very quietly, very politely, so that you are always just slightly out of reach of everything that should have been yours. Alina Voss had lived inside that cruelty for 6 years. She was not a servant. She had never been a servant. But she ate in the kitchen every single night, at a small wooden table pushed against the far wall, with a single candle, and whatever the cook had set aside before the family was served upstairs. And here is the thing that would have surprised most people, had they known. Alina had let it happen. Not because she was weak. Not because she didn't know better. But because Alina Voss was the kind of woman who understood, instinctively, that the moment you show someone what you're protecting, they will find a way to take it from you. She was protecting something. She had been protecting it for 6 years. And in 6 years, not a single member of the Ashford family had thought to wonder why the quiet woman in the kitchen never complained, never cried, never left, and never, not once, stopped reading those strange, dry, impossibly thick books she kept hidden under the kitchen stairs. They were not novels. They were law books. The Ashford estate sat on 400 acres of Yorkshire countryside, and on a clear morning you could stand at the east window of the upper gallery and see all the way to the river. It was the kind of view that made people feel important simply for looking at it. Alina had not been permitted in the upper gallery for 3 years. The restriction had never been stated outright. The Ashfords were far too refined for anything as direct as a rule. It had simply been communicated, the way everything in that house was communicated, through a series of cold silences, redirected conversations, and the occasional remark from Lady Ashford delivered with a smile so thin it could have cut glass. I don't think Alina needs to trouble herself with the upper floors, do you, Mrs. Pratt? And Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, who was a decent woman trapped in an indecent situation, had simply looked at Alina with something close to apology and said nothing at all. Alina had gone back downstairs. She had been 19 years old when she arrived at Ashford Manor. Her father, Gerald Voss, had died in February of that year, suddenly, badly, leaving behind a tangle of debts that his solicitor had spent 3 months trying to unravel before delivering the news that there was simply nothing left. No house, no income, no savings. What there was, apparently, was an arrangement. Gerald Voss had once done a significant service for the late Duke of Ashford, the current Duke's father, a man Alina had met exactly twice and remembered as someone who smelled of pipe tobacco and never quite looked at her directly. In gratitude, the late Duke had promised that should Gerald ever find himself in difficulty, the Ashford family would provide for his daughter. It had seemed at the time like an act of generosity. Alina understood now that generosity and obligation were two very different things, and that the Ashford family had chosen, from the very first week, which one this was going to be. She had been given a room on the 2nd floor, not the family floor, not the servants' floor, but the ambiguous middle passage where visiting relatives and minor guests were housed. The room was small, clean, and entirely without warmth. She had been told she was welcome to take meals with the family. She had been told this exactly once. The first evening, she had dressed carefully and come to the dining room at the appropriate hour. Lady Ashford had looked up from her correspondence with an expression of such genuine surprise, as though Alina had materialized from thin air, that the footman had actually taken a small step backward. "Oh," Lady Ashford had said, "I hadn't realized you'd be joining us." There were 6 people at that table. There were 8 chairs. Alina had counted, but something in the way Lady Ashford had said those 7 words, the precise weight of them, the way they rearranged the air in the room, made it very clear that the empty chair nearest the door was not, in fact, available. Alina had said she wasn't very hungry. She had gone to the kitchen. Cook, a broad, red-faced woman named Mrs. Hobbs, who asked no questions and held no opinions about the peculiarities of the family she worked for, had set a plate in front of her without a word, pointed to the small table by the wall, and gone back to scrubbing her pots. Alina had sat down. She had come back the next night, and the night after that. After 2 weeks, Mrs. Hobbs began saving her the better portion of whatever was being served upstairs. After a month, she began leaving a candle lit. After 6 months, Alina suspected that Mrs. Hobbs had quietly begun cooking slightly more than the family required, so that there would always be enough. It was, in its own way, the kindest thing anyone in that house had ever done for her. Alina was 25 now. She had spent 6 years watching the Ashford family from a careful distance. At church, in the corridors, through doorways she was not technically forbidden from entering, but had learned not to use. She had watched Lady Ashford manage her social calendar like a military campaign. She had watched the eldest daughter, Miss Harriet Ashford, move from season to season in search of a suitable husband, with the cheerful determination of someone who had never once been told no. She had watched the son, Edward Ashford, leave for the continent 3 months after Alina arrived, first for the diplomatic corps, then, when the war widened, for the army itself. She had watched Lady Ashford's face in the moments when the post arrived, the way her hand stilled over whatever she was holding, the small exhale of relief when the letter was routine. Alina had felt something in those moments that she had not expected to feel for any member of this family. She had felt sorry for her. Not enough to forgive her, but enough to understand that even the people who arrange cruelty are sometimes afraid of something too. The law books had begun as practicality. Her father's solicitor, a nervous little man named Mr. Finch, had visited her 3 months after Gerald Voss's death to go over the particulars of the estate, or rather, the particulars of its absence. Alina had sat across from him in the Ashfords' receiving room, which Lady Ashford had made available with the pointed graciousness of someone doing a very visible favor, and she had listened to Mr. Finch explain with great delicacy that there was nothing. Except, he had paused, shuffled his papers, looked at something, and then looked away from it. There may be, he had said very carefully, a matter worth looking into. Regarding your mother's family. There were some arrangements made before her marriage to your father, arrangements that were, perhaps, not entirely resolved. Alina had asked him what he meant. He had said he wasn't certain. He had said the documents were old. He had said he would need more time. He had never come back. Alina had waited 8 months. Then she had written to him. The letter was returned, Mr. Finch had retired, the forwarding address unknown. She had written to his firm. The firm had a new solicitor who knew nothing of the matter. She had written 3 more letters to 3 different legal offices over the following year. 2 never replied. The 3rd replied to say they could not assist without documentation she did not have. It was at that point that Alina had decided she needed to understand the law herself. Not all of it. Enough. Enough to know what questions to ask, what documents to look for, what words meant what and which silences were significant. She had ordered the first book through a bookseller in the village, using the small allowance the Ashford estate provided her each month. a sum so modest it was clearly meant to cover thread and soap and not much else. She had wrapped the book in plain paper and carried it home under her arm and hidden it under the kitchen stairs because her room had no lock, and she had learned very early that private things in the Ashford house had a way of becoming public knowledge. Over 6 years she had accumulated 11 books, 2 legal journals, and a notebook filled with her own careful handwriting. Cross-references, questions, annotations, the slow architecture of a case she did not yet have enough pieces to build. She was still missing something. She had known it for years. She simply did not know yet that the missing piece was about to walk through the front door of Ashford Manor, wearing an army officer's coat, carrying a wound in his left shoulder, and looking at the house he'd grown up in as though he was no longer entirely sure it belonged to him. Edward Ashford had come home from the war. And nothing, Eleanor thought, as she heard the carriage on the gravel drive and the sudden eruption of noise from the floors above her, was going to be the same. She closed her law book. She blew out her candle. And in the darkness of the kitchen, she sat very still, and she waited to see what came next. Edward Ashford had not written to say exactly when he would arrive. This was, his mother would later say to Harriet in the upstairs sitting room, in the particular tone she reserved for disappointments too familiar to be surprising, entirely typical of Edward. He had written in October to say he was recovering. He had written in November to say the recovery was progressing. He had written nothing in December, which had caused Lady Ashford 17 days of quiet, controlled terror, and then a brief note had arrived in January saying simply that he would be home before spring, and that he hoped the east fields had been properly drained, because the flooding last autumn had looked bad from the road. He had arrived on a Tuesday in the rain without warning at 4:30 in the afternoon, which was, as it happened, exactly the wrong time for everyone. Lady Ashford was at a card engagement in the village. Harriet was dressing for dinner. The footmen were in the middle of a complicated situation, involving a broken serving cart and a great deal of spilled claret. And Mrs. Pratt, who would normally have managed all of this with the calm efficiency of a woman who had managed everything in this house for 22 years, was in the linen room on the 3rd floor and did not hear the carriage until it was already on the drive. The only person in the entrance hall when Edward Ashford opened the front door of his own house and walked in out of the rain was Eleanor. She had been crossing from the back corridor to the library, one of the few rooms she still used freely, because no one else seemed to want it in the afternoons, carrying a book and paying very little attention to anything beyond it. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other across the entrance hall, Eleanor with her book pressed against her chest, Edward with rain dripping from the brim of his hat and a travel bag over his good shoulder, and his left arm held at an angle that suggested, to anyone paying attention, that it had not entirely healed. He was taller than she had expected. She had seen him only twice before his departure, brief, peripheral glimpses at a distance. He had been 22 then, and he had carried himself with the easy carelessness of a young man who has never had a reason to be careful. He did not look careless now. His face was the face of someone who had spent a considerable amount of time in conditions that rearranged a person's understanding of what mattered. Leaner, quieter, the kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling but the very deliberate management of it. He looked at her with dark eyes that were, she noted, entirely alert despite what must have been a very long journey. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. "Is my mother at home?" "She's in the village." "She wasn't expecting you." "No," he agreed. "She wasn't." He glanced around the entrance hall with the particular expression of a man recalibrating, taking stock of what had changed, what hadn't, what was missing. "Are you new?" Alina looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I've been here 6 years." Something shifted in his expression, not quite embarrassment but close to it. The honest discomfort of a man who has just realized he has made an error and is deciding how to address it. "I apologize," he said. "I don't." "You were abroad," she said simply. "It's understandable." She did not tell him her name. He did not ask. "Mrs. Pratt arrived at that moment in a state of breathless apology, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of wet coats and travel bags, and someone being sent urgently to the village to inform Lady Ashford that her son was home. Alina went to the library. She sat down. She opened her book. She did not read a single word of it for the better part of an hour. Dinner that evening was, by all accounts, a significant occasion. Lady Ashford had returned from the village in a state of carefully composed emotion, the particular blend of relief and reproach that only mothers of returned soldiers seem capable of producing simultaneously. Harriet had redressed twice. The cook had been given 40 minutes' notice to produce something appropriate for a celebratory meal, and had responded with the grim professionalism of a general informed of an ambush. The dining room, Alina had been told by Mrs. Pratt, who relayed household information to Alina with the neutral efficiency of someone who had long ago decided that what the family didn't specify, she could manage herself, was to be set for 5. Lady Ashford had sent a note to the Pemberton family at the neighboring estate, inviting them for the occasion. The Pembertons had 2 daughters. Alina had understood immediately what kind of celebration this was going to be. She ate in the kitchen. Mrs. Hobbs had made a beef broth that was, by any reasonable measure, considerably better than what was being served upstairs, and Alina sat at her small table and ate it quietly, and listened to the distant sound of the house rearranging itself around the return of its heir. She heard laughter from the dining room at one point, Harriet's laugh, high and genuine, and beneath it something lower and less frequent that must have been Edward. She heard the scrape of chairs, the rhythm of conversation she couldn't make out, the occasional punctuation of Lady Ashford's voice rising above the rest with the clarity of a woman accustomed to being heard. It was, Alina thought, exactly as it always was. She finished her broth. She thanked Mrs. Hobbs. She took her candle and went upstairs to her room. She came back down at 11 o'clock. This was not unusual. Alina had, over the years, developed the habit of returning to the kitchen late in the evening, after the family had retired, after the staff had gone to their quarters, when the house was quiet, and the fire in the kitchen hearth had burned down to a low, steady glow that was better for reading than her room's single lamp. She had not expected anyone to be there. Edward Ashford was sitting at her table. He had changed out of his dinner clothes and was wearing a plain dark coat over a loosened collar, and he had clearly been sitting there for some time, because there was a glass of something at his elbow and the look of a man who had sought out the quietest room in a loud house and intended to stay in it. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Then he said, with no particular inflection, "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," she said. He looked at the book under her arm, then at the chair across from him, her chair, the small one by the wall that Mrs. Hobbs had long ago stopped moving back to its proper place. "Is this your table?" he asked. It was a strange question. It was technically not her table at all. It belonged to the house, which belonged to him, or would when the estate formally transferred. But there was something in the way he asked it that suggested he understood, at least partially, that he had sat down in someone else's place. "It's where I usually sit," she said. He moved his glass. A small gesture making room. Not vacating the table, but acknowledging that she belonged at it. She sat down. She opened her book. He didn't ask what she was reading. She didn't ask how he was finding it, being home. The fire settled. The house breathed around them in its nighttime way, creaks and silences, and the distant sound of wind across the Yorkshire moorland. They sat like that for perhaps 40 minutes. It was, Alina thought afterward, the most comfortable she had felt in 6 years. He came back the next night. And the night after that. He never explained it. She never asked. She suspected that upstairs, the days had a particular texture that Edward was finding difficult. His mother's careful maneuvering, Harriet's cheerful noise, the Pemberton daughters who had already been invited back twice, the slow, relentless pressure of a household that had been waiting 2 years for its heir to come home and perform the functions expected of him. Down here there was none of that. Down here there was just firelight and quiet and 2 people who had, by some unspoken agreement, decided that they did not need to explain themselves to each other. He began bringing a second candle. She began arriving a few minutes earlier. They spoke occasionally, briefly, carefully, the way people speak when they are testing the quality of a silence before breaking it. He asked her once what she was reading. She told him. He didn't ask why a woman in a house like this would be reading a legal treatise on inheritance law at 11 o'clock at night. She noticed that. She noticed most things about him she was finding. The way he held his left arm when he thought no one was watching. The way he looked at the fire when the conversation upstairs had been particularly pointed. A look that was not quite blankness but something more deliberate. The look of a man choosing not to be somewhere he technically was. The way he said things plainly and without performance, which was so unlike the rest of his family that it had startled her the first time and continued to startle her. He was not what she had expected. She was not sure, exactly, what she had expected. An extension of his mother, perhaps. The easy arrogance of a man born into 400 acres and a title. Something she could keep at a simple distance. He was making that difficult. On the 5th night, she came downstairs to find him already there, and already in conversation with Mrs. Hobbs, who was still at the hearth finishing something she'd left going overnight. Alina paused in the doorway. He was asking about the drainage in the east field. Mrs. Hobbs, who in 6 years had never expressed any emotion toward the family beyond a permanent and magnificent neutrality, was telling him about the flooding in considerable detail, and Edward was listening, actually listening. Alina could see it, not waiting for the conversation to end but following it, asking follow-up questions, nodding at things that warranted nodding. She must have made some small sound because he looked up. Miss, he stopped. He realized visibly that he still didn't know her name. Voss, she said. Alina Voss. Something moved across his face. Quick, like light crossing water. Voss, he repeated. And then carefully, my father knew a Voss. Yes, Alina said. He did. A pause. Edward looked at her with the focused attention of a man recalibrating again. The same look he had worn in the entrance hall on the first day, but deeper now and more deliberate. You're Gerald Voss's daughter, he said. Not a question. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him placing pieces together. Her presence in the house, the kitchen, the 6 years, the arrangement his father had made. She watched him arrive at the understanding most people arrived at, that Alina was here because she had nowhere else to be, and that the family had accommodated this with all the warmth of people fulfilling a contractual obligation. What she did not expect was what he said next. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your father." And about, he stopped, glanced briefly at the small table, the single chair, the kitchen that was not a dining room and had never been intended to be one. About the arrangement. Alina looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. She sat down. He sat down. "Mrs. Hobbs put something on the table between them without being asked, 2 cups, something warm, and went back to her hearth as though none of this was happening. They sat in silence for a while. Then Edward said, without looking up from his cup, "What are you reading tonight?" Alina turned the book so he could see the spine. He read the title. His eyes came up to hers. "Inheritance Law," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, then was strictly conversational. Then he looked back down at his cup. "Interesting," he said quietly, and said nothing else. But that night, Alina noticed, he stayed an hour later than usual. The announcement came on a Thursday morning, delivered by Lady Ashford at breakfast with the casual precision of someone who had been planning it for considerably longer than she was letting on. Alina was not at breakfast, of course. She heard about it from Harriet. This was not unusual. Harriet Ashford was 23 years old and possessed of a personality so fundamentally incapable of containing information that she functioned, entirely without meaning to, as the household's most reliable news source. She did not gossip maliciously, she simply could not hold things. They spilled out of her like water from a cup that was always slightly too full. She found Alina in the library that afternoon, dropped into the chair across from her with the controlled urgency of someone delivering intelligence, and said, "Mother has invited the Cecilys for a fortnight." Alina looked up. "The Cecilys?" "Lady Cecily Bramwell." Harriet lowered her voice, despite the fact that they were entirely alone. "And her mother." "For a fortnight, Alina." "A fortnight? That's not a visit, that's a campaign." Alina set her book down. Lady Cecily Bramwell was, by the account of every social publication Alina had managed to read over the past several years, the foremost unmarried daughter of the Earl of Bramwell, a family whose fortune was old, whose connections were older, and whose interest in aligning themselves with a Yorkshire dukedom had apparently been ongoing for some time. She was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. "Edward knows?" Alina asked. Harriet made a face that communicated volumes. "Mother told him this morning." "He said," she paused, seeming to search her memory for the exact words. "He said, I see," and then he asked about the Eastfield drainage again. Alina looked back at her book. "I see," she said. Lady Cecily Bramwell arrived on a Friday, in a carriage that was newer and better appointed than anything the Ashford estate kept, accompanied by her mother, 2 ladies' maids, and enough luggage to suggest she had not entirely ruled out an extended stay. Alina watched the arrival from the library window. Lady Cecily stepped out of the carriage and looked up at the manor with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely unreadable. Not awe, not calculation, but something carefully positioned between the two. She was tall and fair, with the kind of posture that suggested it had been corrected so many times in childhood that it had simply become structural. She was, Alina noted with the impartiality of someone cataloging a fact, every bit as beautiful as described. Edward was standing on the steps to receive them. Alina watched him bow over Lady Cecily's hand, with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to perform the required gestures. She watched Lady Cecily smile, a precise, warm, utterly controlled smile. They looked from the library window, exactly like what Lady Ashford intended them to become. Alina turned away from the window. The reassignment came the following morning. Mrs. Pratt delivered it in person, which suggested Lady Ashford had understood that this particular communication required a human face rather than a written note. Lady Ashford has asked, Mrs. Pratt said, standing in the doorway of Alina's room with the expression of a woman who has been asked to do something she finds distasteful, but intends to do professionally, whether you might be willing to assist Lady Cecily during her stay, as a companion of sorts, to help her find her way around the house. Make her comfortable. Alina looked at her. A personal assistant, Alina said. Mrs. Pratt did not correct her. Lady Ashford thought, given that you know the house well, and that Lady Cecily's ladies' maids are already occupied with her wardrobe. Of course, Alina said. Mrs. Pratt looked at her with something that was almost relief and almost sorrow. You don't have to. It's fine, Mrs. Pratt. It was not fine. They both knew it was not fine. Alina had arrived at this house as the daughter of a man the late Duke had owed a debt to, and she was now being deployed as a convenience for the woman being positioned to replace her at the table she had never been permitted to sit at in the first place. But Alina had spent 6 years learning when to be still. This was a time to be still. Lady Cecily was not what Alina had expected. She had prepared herself for coldness, the particular brand of aristocratic indifference that Alina had come to understand as the default setting of women who had been told since birth that their value was architectural, that they were meant to be placed in rooms and admired, not to move through the world with any particular intention of their own. Lady Cecily was not cold. She was sharp. Not unkindly sharp, but sharp the way a person is sharp when they have spent a long time in rooms where they were expected to be decorative, and have responded by paying very close attention to everything. She received Alina in her room on the first morning, with a directness that bypassed the usual ceremonies entirely. You're Miss Voss, she said. Not a question. Yes. Lady Ashford tells me you've been with the family for some years. 6 years. Lady Cecily looked at her with cool, assessing eyes. And before that, my father died. There was an arrangement. What sort of arrangement? Alina paused. It was not a question she was often asked directly. Most people in the house had long ago stopped wondering about the specifics of her presence. She had simply become a feature of the place, like the crack in the east corridor ceiling that everyone had noticed and no one had repaired. A debt of honor, Alina said carefully. The late Duke felt an obligation to my father. Lady Cecily was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved just briefly to the room around her, then back to Alina. Taking stock of something. I see, she said. It was the same phrase Edward had used when told about the fortnight visit. Alina found herself wondering whether that particular combination of words meant something different when said by a person who was actually seeing. The days settled into a pattern. Alina accompanied Lady Cecily through the house each morning. The gallery, the gardens, the east wing that Lady Ashford had redecorated 3 years ago and was clearly hoping to display to advantage. Lady Cecily asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to the answers, and she treated Alina with a matter-of-fact courtesy that was so different from the rest of the household that Alina found herself slightly off balance by it. She did not perform gratitude. She did not condescend. She simply spoke to Alina, as though Alina was a person worth speaking to. It was, in its way, unsettling. Edward, during these days, was managed. There was no other word for it. Lady Ashford orchestrated his proximity to Lady Cecily with the invisible efficiency of a woman who had been planning this particular sequence of events for long enough that it had become instinct. Rides arranged to happen simultaneously. Afternoons in the drawing room that somehow always required Edward's presence. Dinners where the seating placed them side by side with the inevitability of gravity. Alina watched it from the periphery. She watched Edward submit to it with the patience of a man who has survived a war and understands, at a fundamental level, that there are certain battles not worth the cost. He was not rude to Lady Cecily. He was not cold. He was simply present, in the way that a very large and very still animal is present, contained and watchful, and not entirely committed to the direction it was being guided. Alina noticed something else. On the third evening, passing the drawing-room doorway, she observed Edward in conversation with Lady Cecily over a game of cards. Lady Cecily said something, quietly, so Alina couldn't hear, and Edward glanced up. His eyes went, with no apparent intention, directly to the doorway. Directly to Alina. For a half-second. Then back to his cards. Alina walked on. It was on the fifth day that Lady Cecily said it. They were in the garden, walking the east path that ran along the old stone wall, where the roses would be in another 6 weeks. The morning was cold and bright, and Lady Cecily walked with her hands clasped behind her back in a way that Alina had begun to recognize as her thinking posture. They had been speaking about the house, the history of it, the generations of Ashfords, the portraits in the gallery. Alina had been telling her about the late Duke's renovation of the library, which she knew well because she had spent considerable time in it. Lady Cecily had listened, and then she had been quiet for a moment, and then she said, without any particular change in her tone, "They're hiding something about your father's estate." Alina stopped walking. Lady Cecily stopped too. She turned and looked at Alina with those clear, assessing eyes, and she said, "I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think you may already know it, and I think you deserve to have someone say it plainly." Alina looked at her for a long moment. "What do you know?" she said. "Not much," Lady Cecily said honestly. "My father knew the late Duke. They had business dealings many years ago. There was something mentioned about an arrangement that was more complicated than it appeared, regarding a woman who married below her family's expectations and whose interests were subsequently," she paused, selecting the word carefully, "managed." The cold morning air seemed, suddenly, very still. "My mother," Alina said. Lady Cecily did not confirm it, but she did not deny it either. "I don't know the particulars," she said. "I was a child when I heard it, and I heard very little. But I have thought about it since arriving here and watching how this household treats you, and I think—" Another pause. "I think someone went to considerable trouble to make sure you would never think to look." Alina stood very still. 6 years of law books. 6 years of letters sent and unanswered. 6 years of Mr. Finch, who had retired without a forwarding address, and a firm that knew nothing, and a document she had been told didn't exist. "Why are you telling me this?" Alina asked. Lady Cecily looked at her steadily. "Because I am being brought here to marry a man I have met 4 times, in a house where I will spend the rest of my life, and I should like, at minimum, to know what I am walking into. A beat." And because you seem to me like someone who has been waiting a very long time for a reason to stop being patient. The roses along the stone wall were still weeks from blooming. Alina looked at them anyway. There was a solicitor, she said finally. My father's. He came once, after my father died, and said there might be something worth looking into. And then he disappeared. Solicitors don't disappear, Lady Cecily said. They retire. They are paid. They are persuaded. Yes, said Alina. Is there anyone else? Anyone who might have known your mother's family? Alina was quiet for a moment. There was one name. There had always been one name, sitting at the back of everything she knew, in the margins of the letters she'd found among her father's things after his death. A name attached to a law office in Leeds, mentioned twice in her father's handwriting in a context she had never been able to fully decipher. She had written to that office twice. Both letters had been returned unopened. Perhaps, she said. Lady Cecily nodded once. As though this was sufficient. As though she had delivered what she came to deliver, and the rest was Alina's business. She turned and resumed walking along the rose path. After a moment, Alina walked with her. They did not speak again until they reached the house. But something had shifted in the air between them, in the particular quality of the silence. Alina went upstairs. She went to her room, not the library, and she sat on the edge of her bed and she looked at the wall for a very long time. Then she took out the notebook from under the loose board beneath her window, the one she had been filling for 6 years, and she opened it to a fresh page. And she began, at last, to write the letter she should have written years ago. That night, she did not go down to the kitchen at 11 o'clock. She was still writing. She did not notice, until the following morning, that she had kept Edward waiting. She noticed because Mrs. Hobbs mentioned, entirely without expression, while setting out Alina's breakfast, that the young Duke had sat in the kitchen until nearly midnight before going back upstairs. He had left Alina's candle burning. The letter took her 4 days to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, Alina had known, in the abstract, what needed to be said for years. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and committing it to paper in a way that cannot be taken back, and Alina had spent long enough being careful that the act of being deliberate felt, in itself, like a kind of exposure. She wrote it 7 times. The first 3 versions were too formal, the careful, distant prose of someone trying not to seem desperate. The 4th was too much the opposite, and she burned it in the kitchen hearth at midnight because reading it back felt like opening a wound in front of a stranger. The 5th and 6th were better but incomplete, missing something she couldn't name until she sat with the silence long enough to understand what it was. She was not asking for help. She was presenting evidence. That was the 7th letter. Precise. Methodical. Laying out, in the clear and unembellished language she had spent 6 years learning, exactly what she knew, exactly what she suspected, and exactly what she needed from a law office in Leeds that had twice returned her letters unopened. She posted it on a Tuesday in the village herself. She told no one. 3 weeks passed. The Bramwells extended their stay, not by announcement but by the quiet accumulation of days, each one producing some small reason why departure remained inconvenient. Lady Ashford received this extension with the barely concealed satisfaction of a chess player watching pieces move exactly where she'd intended. Edward endured it. That was the word that came to Alina's mind when she watched him in the drawing-room evenings, in the structured social hours that Lady Ashford produced each day with the reliability of a clock. Endured. He was not unhappy precisely. He was present in the way that a man is present when he has decided that presence is the minimum required and has given it accordingly. Lady Cecily, Alina noticed, watched him with the same calm attention she turned on everything, and seemed to reach her own conclusions quietly. The kitchen evenings had resumed. Neither of them mentioned the night Alina hadn't come. It existed between them as a small, acknowledged absence, like a skipped word in a sentence that the listener fills in automatically and moves past. Edward had begun bringing things down with him. A book occasionally. Papers from the estate that he spread on the table and read, with the focused attention of a man trying to understand something that had been mismanaged for some time. He asked Alina once, casually, without particular inflection, whether she had noticed anything about the tenant records in the East Quarter. She had noticed a great deal about the tenant records in the East Quarter. They talked for 2 hours. She knew afterward that she should not have let it go on that long. That there was a particular danger in being useful to someone, in becoming the person they came to when they wanted to think clearly rather than perform. She understood the architecture of what was being built in that kitchen, in those late hours, in the particular quality of attention Edward Ashford paid her when she spoke. She understood it and she could not seem to stop it, and she told herself firmly that there were more important things to attend to. She was still telling herself this when the reply from Leeds arrived. It came on a Friday morning in the post, addressed in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Careful, elderly, the letters slightly larger than necessary in the way of someone whose eyes had begun to require accommodation. It was not from the law office. The law office, the letter explained in its opening lines, had dissolved some years ago upon the retirement of its founding partner. The writer of this letter had been that partner's clerk for 31 years. He had, upon his employer's death the previous autumn, been charged with the task of sorting through the accumulated files of a long career, and in doing so, had come across several items that had been, in the writer's careful phrasing, set aside for reasons that were not entirely clear to him, but which he had come to feel, upon reflection, were not reasons he was comfortable maintaining. His name was Mr. Albert Holt. He was 71 years old. He wrote that he had received Alina's original letters, both of them, and that they had not been returned by accident. He wrote that he was sorry for that. He wrote that he would like, if Miss Voss was willing to meet. Alina read the letter 4 times in her room. Then she sat very still for a long while, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the strange physical sensation of something that has been held tightly for a very long time beginning, fractionally, to release. She had known there was something. She had known it the way you know a thing you have no proof of, not with the clean certainty of fact, but with the deeper, more persistent certainty of a person who has been told a story that doesn't quite add up and has spent years quietly checking the arithmetic. Mr. Holt was not the missing piece, but he knew where the missing piece was. She wrote back the same afternoon. She arranged to meet him in Leeds in 10 days' time, at an address he provided, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She told no one. Getting to Leeds required, among other things, getting out of Ashford Manor without generating the kind of notice that would produce questions she wasn't ready to answer. This was less difficult than it might have been, because the house, in its current state, was substantially occupied with itself. Lady Ashford was deep in the planning of a dinner party, the formal, declarative kind, with 20 guests, and a seating arrangement that she had revised 14 times and would, Alina suspected, revise 14 more. Harriet had developed an intense and consuming interest in a new piece of music that she was attempting to learn on the pianoforte with more enthusiasm than aptitude. The Bramwells were preparing for a brief trip to York and would be absent for 3 days. And Edward was in the North Fields. He had been in the North Fields for most of the past week, dealing with a drainage situation that had turned out to be considerably more complicated than the tenant's letter had suggested. He came back in the evenings tired and mud-spattered and more talkative than usual, the way people become talkative after long days of physical problem-solving when their minds are still running ahead of their bodies. He had asked her, on the 4th evening, what she would do with the east pasture. She had told him. He had looked at her over his cup for a moment and said, "That's exactly right." She had gone upstairs earlier than usual that night. She took the early coach from the village on a Wednesday, telling Mrs. Pratt she had an errand in Leeds and would return by evening. Mrs. Pratt asked no questions. Elinor suspected that Mrs. Pratt had never asked questions because she had spent 22 years in this house, understanding that the answers were frequently things she would then be obligated to act on. Leeds was gray and busy and smelled of industry, in the way that cities increasingly did, the particular combination of coal smoke and commerce that was reshaping every English town of consequence. Elinor had not been in a city of any size for 6 years, and the noise of it was briefly startling, like stepping from a quiet room into a street full of people all talking at once. She found the address without difficulty. It was a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of street that had once been respectable and was settling into a comfortable, slightly worn middle age. The door was answered by a woman of about 50, who showed Elinor into a sitting room that smelled of old paper, and was furnished with the cheerful clutter of a man who has spent his life working with documents and never entirely stopped. Mr. Albert Holt came in 5 minutes later. He was exactly as she had imagined from his letter, small, careful, carrying his 71 years in the particular way of men who have spent their lives seated at desks, slightly curved at the shoulders, with very bright, very attentive eyes above a face that had been weathered by decades of reading small print in inadequate light. He shook her hand with both of his. "Miss Voss," he said, "I am very glad you came." "Mr. Holt," she said, "I have waited 6 years for this meeting." "I know," he said. "I am sorry for that. Please sit down." He told her about her mother first. Her mother's name had been Catherine Ashford. Elinor had known this. She had known her mother's maiden name, had grown up knowing it, had simply never connected it to the Ashford family of Yorkshire, because her father had never once spoken of his wife's origins with any specificity, and the Ashford family had never once spoken of her mother at all. Catherine Ashford had been the younger sister of the late Duke, the father of Edward, of Harriet, of the man who had sat across from Elinor in a kitchen for weeks without knowing who she was. She had been 18 when she met Gerald Voss, 20 when she married him, and 23 when she died, 3 years after Elinor was born, of a fever that came quickly and did not leave. Elinor had no memory of her. The marriage had not been approved. Mr. Holt said this with the careful understatement of a man, summarizing something that had, at the time, been considerably more than disapproval. Catherine Ashford had chosen, in the language of her family, badly. A man of modest means, no title, no land, no connection of any particular use to the Ashford estate. She had chosen him anyway, in the way that some people choose things, with the completeness of someone who has assessed the cost and decided it is worth paying. Her family had not cut her off entirely. That would have been too visible. Instead, they had done what the Ashford family did with things that were inconvenient, They had arranged them. They had ensured that Catherine's share of the family inheritance, not the estate, not the entail, but a separate settlement left by her mother, Eleanor's grandmother, specifically designated for female descendants, was placed into a trust administered by the family solicitor. Gerald Voss had known about the trust. He had spent 20 years trying to access it on his daughter's behalf. He had been told, repeatedly, by multiple solicitors, that the documentation was incomplete, that the trust required certain conditions to be met, that the matter was under review. "There was no review, Mr. Holt said quietly. He had his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at them as he said it, and then he looked up at Eleanor. The documentation was not incomplete. The conditions had been met at your birth. The trust was yours, Miss Voss. It has been yours since the day your grandmother's will was executed. It was simply never released." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "By whom?" she said. "By the late Duke's instruction, Mr. Holt said. My employer, the senior partner, was given to understand that the Ashford family wished the matter to remain unresolved. He was not an evil man, Miss Voss, but he was a pragmatic one, and the Ashfords were significant clients, and pragmatism, in my experience, is often the most comfortable disguise for cowardice." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a cart passed on the street. The sound came through the window and faded. "What is in the trust?" Eleanor asked. Mr. Holt reached to the table beside his chair and picked up a folder. Old, the leather worn at the corners, the papers inside visible at the edges. He held it for a moment before offering it to her. "Your grandmother left your mother a property," he said. "A house and its associated land in the West Riding. Modest by the Ashford standard, approximately 80 acres, a working farm, a dower house in reasonable repair as of the last survey, which was some years ago now." Eleanor took the folder. "Additionally, Mr. Holt said, there is the matter of your mother's position in relation to the Ashford estate itself." Eleanor looked up. "Your grandmother's will," he said carefully, "contained a provision that was, at the time, somewhat unusual. In the event that the male Ashford line produced no heir, or in the event that the primary heir died without issue, Catherine's descendants were named as secondary beneficiaries to a portion of the estate. Edward is the heir," Eleanor said. "He is alive. He has no children yet, but—" "Yes, Mr. Holt said. "That provision is unlikely to be relevant in practice. But it exists. It is documented. It is legal." He paused. "And its existence means that your grandmother formally recognized your mother's bloodline as connected to the Ashford estate. Which means, Miss Voss, whatever the family chose to pretend, you are not here as the recipient of a charitable arrangement." He looked at her with those very bright, very attentive eyes. "You are here," he said, "because it is, in a very specific sense, your family's house." Eleanor sat with this information for a long time. Mr. Holt did not rush her. He poured tea that his housekeeper brought in, and he sat across from her with the patience of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down, and he let her read. The documents were old but clear. Her grandmother's handwriting in the original will was small and precise. The trust documentation was thorough. The property records were attached, surveys, tenant records, a letter from a land agent dated 15 years ago describing the farm as productive and well-maintained. 80 acres. A house. Hers. Had been hers, technically and legally and without any valid dispute, since the day she was born. She thought about the kitchen table, the single candle, the 6 years of law books under the stairs. She thought about the letter from the firm that had said they could not assist her. She thought about Mr. Finch, who had seen something in those papers 26 years ago and had been persuaded, or paid, or frightened into retirement before he could tell her. She thought about Edward, last Tuesday, spreading estate papers on the kitchen table and asking her what she would do with the east pasture. She thought about the upper gallery she had not been permitted to enter for 3 years. She did not cry. She was, she found, entirely beyond crying about it. What she felt was not grief. It was the cold, clarifying sensation of a person who has been standing in a fog for 6 years and has stepped, finally, into clear air, and can see exactly how far the fog extended and exactly what it was hiding. "What do I need to do?" she said. Mr. Holt nodded, as though he had been waiting for exactly this question, as though it was the question that indicated she was ready. "There is a solicitor in Leeds," he said, "a reputable firm, entirely unconnected to the Ashford family, who I believe would be willing to take your case. The documentation is sound. The trust is unambiguous. There will be resistance." "I know there will be resistance," Eleanor said. "And it will not be comfortable." "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine it will be." Mr. Holt looked at her for a moment. "Your mother," he said, "was the most determined person I ever encountered. She decided to marry your father despite everything, and she did it, and she never, as far as I know, expressed a moment of regret." He paused. "I only met her twice, but I have thought of her often over the years. I think she would have found the situation you have been placed in intolerable." "She would have," Eleanor said. She did not know this. She had no memory of her mother, and no stories that hadn't been filtered through her father's grief-softened recollections. But she believed it completely. She took the late coach back. She arrived at Ashford Manor at 8:30 in the evening, came in through the side entrance, went up to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed with the folder on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and the strange, ringing silence of a woman who has just been handed back something that was stolen from her before she was old enough to know it was gone. She heard the household settling around her, the sounds of evening dinner concluded, the family dispersing to their separate occupations. She heard, at some point, footsteps on the kitchen stairs. She looked at the folder for a long time. Then she put it carefully back under the loose board beneath her window, next to the notebook, and she went downstairs. Edward was already there. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Something in his face shifted. A brief, unguarded movement quickly settled. "You were in Leeds," he said. She looked at him. "Mrs. Pratt told you." "Mrs. Pratt told my mother. My mother told me to see if I knew what you were doing there." A pause. "I said I didn't." "You didn't," Eleanor said. "No." She sat down at her table. "Mrs. Hobbs had gone to bed, the kitchen was theirs, the fire low and steady, the house quiet around them. Edward was watching her with the focused, patient attention he brought to things he was trying to understand. "Are you all right?" he said. It was such a plain question. So entirely without performance. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "I think so." He didn't ask anything else. He reached across the table and moved the candle slightly, so the light fell better where she was sitting. It was such a small thing. Eleanor looked at the candle for a moment. Then she looked at Edward Ashford, sitting across from her at the kitchen table in his own house in the firelight, watching her with eyes that were, she understood with a sudden, unwelcome clarity, not at all the eyes of a man who thought of her as a charity arrangement. "Edward," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. He went very still. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He looked at her for a moment. Then he folded his hands on the table, and he nodded. And Alina began. She told him everything. Not quickly, not in the breathless, uncontrolled way of someone releasing pressure that has built too long. Alina had spent 6 years learning to say things precisely, and she said this precisely. Her mother's name, the trust, the property in the West Riding, Mr. Finch, who had vanished, the letters returned unopened, Mr. Holt in his cluttered Leeds sitting room with his bright eyes, and his folder of documents that had been sitting in a dead man's filing cabinet for 30 years. She told him about her grandmother's will. She told him what Mr. Holt had said about the late Duke's instructions. She told him about the kitchen stairs and the law books and the 6 years of careful, patient, methodical preparation for a conversation she had not known, exactly, when she would be ready to have. Edward did not speak. He had said he would hear all of it, and he did, sitting absolutely still across the kitchen table with his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and the firelight moving across his features in a way that made it difficult to read him, which she suspected was not an accident because Edward Ashford, she had come to understand, managed his expressions with the same deliberate care that he managed everything else he didn't want to lose control of. She finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up across the moors, the particular low sound it made when it was moving fast, and there was nothing to slow it. A sound Alina had fallen asleep to for 6 years and still sometimes found, in spite of everything, comforting. Edward looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "My father knew. It was not a question." "Yes," Alina said. "He knew who you were. He knew about the trust. He knew about the property." He said each sentence separately, as though he was setting them down in a row and examining them. "And he brought you here anyway." "I think," Alina said carefully, "that the arrangement served 2 purposes. It fulfilled the obligation to my father, publicly, visibly, while ensuring that I remained close enough to be managed and too dependent to make trouble." Edward looked up at her. "You were never dependent," he said. "No," she said. "But they didn't know that." A long silence. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About your mother's family. About the connection to us." "I suspected something for 5 years," she said. "I knew yesterday." He absorbed this. "Yesterday," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at her, and for a moment the careful management slipped, just fractionally, and she saw something underneath it that was not quite anger and not quite anguish but occupied the space between them with the weight of both. "You came down here tonight," he said. "After finding that out yesterday. You came and sat at this table." "I always come," she said. Alina, it was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land somewhere it probably shouldn't have. "I didn't know how else to begin," she said honestly. "I needed to tell someone and she stopped. Chose the next words carefully. "You are the person I think most clearly with. I don't know when that happened. But it's true." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the hearth and stood there with his back to her, one hand on the mantelpiece and his left arm held at that angle she had learned to recognize. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said. "Not the documents. I understand about the documents. But the kitchen. The gallery. He stopped. She could see his shoulders, the tension across them. Why didn't you say anything? She looked at his back. Would you have believed the woman eating in your kitchen? He turned around. The expression on his face was, she thought, the most unguarded she had ever seen him. And she had seen him at 11 o'clock at night for weeks, tired and mud-spattered and not performing anything for anyone. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He could not answer. They both knew he could not answer, because the honest answer was complicated in a way that implicated not just him, but the entire machinery of assumption and inheritance and social arrangement that had made the kitchen the only room where Alina Voss had been allowed to simply exist. No, he said finally. Not at first. No, she agreed without bitterness. Not at first. He came back to the table. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of it, looking at her, with the expression of a man who is trying to locate solid ground and finding that the landscape has shifted considerably more than he realized. What are you going to do? He said. I'm going to engage the solicitor, Mr. Holt recommended, she said. I'm going to file the documentation to have the trust released. I'm going to claim the property in the West Riding. My mother will fight it. I know. It won't be quiet, Alina. She will make it as difficult as possible. She will. Edward, he stopped. I know, she said again. I have been preparing for this for 6 years. I am not afraid of difficult. He looked at her. Something settled in his face, not acceptance exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of a man seeing clearly for the first time something that had been there all along. All right, he said quietly. He sat back down. Tell me what you need, he said. Lady Ashford found out on a Thursday. Alina did not know precisely how, whether it was the visit to the solicitor's office in Leeds, which could not be kept entirely invisible, or whether Mrs. Pratt had said something, or whether Lady Ashford had simply been watching more carefully than Alina had accounted for. It didn't matter. What mattered was that on Thursday morning, Alina was summoned. Not asked. Not invited. Summoned. The word Mrs. Pratt used, delivered to Alina's doorway with the expression of someone who has been given a message they would have preferred not to carry. Lady Ashford's private sitting room was on the second floor, south-facing, with a window that overlooked the formal garden. It was a room Alina had entered perhaps a dozen times in 6 years, always at Lady Ashford's request, always for the purpose of some small household adjustment that Lady Ashford wished to communicate directly. It had never felt like a comfortable room. It felt considerably less comfortable now. Lady Ashford was standing at the window when Alina came in. She did not turn immediately. This was, Alina knew, a technique, the pause, the withheld attention, the small choreography of making someone wait. Alina waited. Lady Ashford turned. She was, Alina thought, a handsome woman in the way that certain kinds of determination become handsome over time. The face shaped by decades of knowing exactly what she wanted and pursuing it with total, unwavering commitment. She was 61 years old and looked perhaps 50 and carried herself like someone considerably younger, because posture, in Lady Ashford's experience, was largely a matter of will. She looked at Alina now with an expression that was perfectly composed and entirely cold. I understand, she said, that you have been consulting a solicitor. Yes, Alina said. In regard to some documents, you believe you have a claim to. In regard to documents, I have a legal claim to, Alina said. Yes. A pause. Something moved through Lady Ashford's expression very quickly, and then it was gone. Miss Voss, she said, I want to speak to you plainly. Please do. This family has provided for you for 6 years. We have given you a home, meals, a roof. Whatever grievances you may have constructed in your mind regarding your situation here, the reality is that you have been treated with considerable generosity, and I would ask you to consider that before proceeding with something that will cause a great deal of unnecessary difficulty for everyone. Elinor looked at her steadily. Lady Ashford, she said, I have a property in the West Riding that has been held from me since birth. I have a trust established by my grandmother that has not been released despite all legal conditions having been met. These are not grievances I have constructed. They are documented facts. Lady Ashford's chin lifted fractionally. Those documents are old, and their interpretation is disputed. They are not disputed, Elinor said. They have simply never been challenged, because no one expected me to know enough to challenge them. A silence. Something shifted in Lady Ashford's face, not softening, nothing so simple as that. More like the expression of a chess player who has watched an opponent make a move that changes the entire board and is calculating, rapidly and without visible distress, what comes next. What is it you want? Lady Ashford said. What is mine? Elinor said. And if we were to make an arrangement? We had an arrangement, Elinor said. I ate in your kitchen for 6 years. Lady Ashford looked at her. For a very long moment, nothing moved in that room. Then Lady Ashford said, quietly and with great precision, You will regret this. Perhaps, Elinor said. But I have spent 6 years regretting nothing and having nothing. I find I prefer the version where the regret comes with a reason. She left. The house changed after that. Not dramatically. The Ashfords were not a family for drama, preferring the violence of cold fronts to the violence of storms. But the temperature dropped in every room Elinor entered. Harriet, who was constitutionally incapable of sustained coldness, continued speaking to Elinor with her usual warm disorganization, but did so now with the slightly anxious look of someone aware they were violating a protocol and uncertain how seriously to take it. The Bramwells returned from York. Lady Cecily found Elinor in the library on the second morning and closed the door behind her. I hear things are moving, she said. They are, Elinor said. Good. She sat down in the chair across from Elinor, with the composed directness Elinor had come to associate with her. My mother is asking questions. About the nature of the legal matter. Lady Ashford told her it was a minor estate dispute involving a dependent. That's one way to describe it, Elinor said. I told my mother, Lady Cecily said, that I believed it was considerably more than that, and that I thought the Ashford family's handling of it reflected poorly on their character. Elinor looked at her. Lady Cecily, I am being brought here to marry into this family, she said calmly. I think I am entitled to form a view of their character. A pause. Besides, I told you 6 weeks ago that someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure you would never think to look. I am glad you looked. Elinor was quiet for a moment. It may make things difficult for you, she said. If you are seen to be. Miss Voss, Lady Cecily looked at her with those clear eyes. I have been managed and maneuvered and positioned my entire life. I think I can manage one conversation with my mother. Elinor found herself, unexpectedly, almost smiling. Edward said nothing to his mother. This was, Elinor came to understand, a more powerful statement than anything he could have said. Lady Ashford had clearly expected either his intervention on her behalf or his confrontation, some form of active engagement that she could work with, respond to, redirect. His silence gave her nothing. He continued to attend dinner. He continued to ride out to the estate each morning. He continued in the evenings to come down to the kitchen. He did not tell Elena what conversations were happening upstairs. She did not ask. But one evening he came in and sat down and was quiet for longer than usual, and eventually he said, "My mother offered your solicitor a settlement to drop the case." Elena looked at him. "My solicitor declined," she said. "I know." She told me he was looking at the fire. She also told me that she intends to contest the will's interpretation in court, that she has engaged her own legal representation. I expected that. Elena, he turned from the fire and looked at her directly. This is going to be very public. When it goes to court, and it will go to court, she won't settle now, it will be reported. People will know. Your name will be. My name, Elena said, has been nothing in this house for 6 years. I think I can withstand it being something, even if the something is complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "She is going to say things about your mother. About the marriage. She will use whatever she can find to make the claim look, to make you look. I know. It isn't true. I know that too. He stopped. Something moved across his face, that unguarded thing again, surfacing briefly before he caught it. I want you to know that I know it. Whatever is said. I know it. Elena looked at him. The fire was low. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the moors were dark and the wind had dropped for once, and the silence was the particular full silence of a Yorkshire night when everything has gone still. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. Edward looked at his hands. "Because," he said, "I should have known who you were from the beginning. And I didn't. And I would like a pause. Long enough that she thought he might not finish it. I would like to be someone you can rely on now. Even though I was not before." Elena was quiet for a long time. "You left a candle burning," she said finally. He looked up. "The night I didn't come down," she said. "You sat here until midnight, and then you went upstairs. But you left the candle burning." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "That was," she said carefully, "not the action of someone who thinks of me as a charity arrangement." "No," he said. "It wasn't." The fire settled. Neither of them said anything else. But Elena did not go upstairs for another 2 hours, and Edward did not either, and the candle burned between them on the kitchen table until it was nearly gone, and neither of them moved to replace it. The court date was set for the 4th of March. Lady Ashford received this news at breakfast and said nothing. Harriet, who had been told the broad outline of the situation by this point, and had responded with the wholehearted indignation of someone who processes information emotionally first and practically second, had cried twice and hugged Elena once in the corridor, in a way that suggested she was not entirely clear whose side she was supposed to be on, and had decided, fundamentally, that she was on Elena's. Lady Cecily came to find Elena the evening before the hearing. She found her in the library, as expected, not reading. She sat down. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I intend to tell my mother that I will not be proceeding with the arrangement Lady Ashford has in mind." Elena looked at her. "That is nothing to do with." "It is entirely to do with." Lady Cecily stopped herself. Composed. "It is to do with several things. This is one of them." A pause. "He doesn't look at me the way he looks at you. I think we both know that. And I find I have too much self-respect to pretend otherwise for the sake of an alliance. My mother wants more than I do. Alina had no answer for this. Lady Cecily stood. Good luck tomorrow, she said. She left. Alina sat in the library for a long time afterward, not reading, not thinking about the court hearing, thinking instead about what it meant that the woman being maneuvered toward Edward Ashford had more dignity than the entire machinery maneuvering her, and what it meant that she herself had spent 6 years eating in a kitchen, and was only here, at the edge of something she couldn't quite name and wasn't sure she was entitled to want. She went downstairs. Edward was already there. He looked up. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. She sat down. He poured something from the pot on the hearth into a cup and set it in front of her without being asked. They sat together in the kitchen until very late. And in the morning, Alina Voss went to court. The courthouse in Leeds was a gray stone building that smelled of cold air and old paper, and the particular institutional solemnity of a place where consequential things were decided by people who had learned to decide them without visible emotion. Alina had been inside it once before, 3 weeks earlier, to file the initial documentation with her solicitor, a precise, unhurried man named Mr. Caro, who had reviewed the Holt documents with the focused attention of someone reading something they found genuinely interesting, and had said, at the end of that meeting, that he believed the case was as solid as any he had handled in 20 years of practice. He had also said, with the honest qualification of a man who respected her enough not to manage her expectations, the Ashford family's representation will not make it simple. Solid cases can be made complicated. Be prepared for that. She had been prepared. She was standing outside the courthouse on the 4th of March in a gray coat and her best pair of gloves, more prepared than she had been for anything in her life. What she had not prepared for was Edward. He was standing at the top of the courthouse steps. He had not told her he was coming. She had not asked him to come. She had, in fact, spent the coach journey from the village constructing a careful internal architecture of self-sufficiency. She had done this alone for 6 years. She would do this alone today. She did not need. He saw her at the bottom of the steps. He came down. He did not say anything. He simply fell into step beside her and walked with her up the steps and through the door. And Alina, who had been preparing to be alone, found that she could not immediately locate the part of herself that had been so certain she preferred it. You didn't have to come, she said. I know, he said. They went inside. Lady Ashford's solicitor was a man named Mr. Forsyth, tall, silver-haired, with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent 40 years in courtrooms, and understood that the first thing you establish is not your argument but your authority. He established it immediately. The will, he argued, was clear in its original intent, but ambiguous in its application. The trust conditions, properly interpreted, had not been met. The relevant clause required documentation of legitimate descent that the claimant could not, he suggested, produce to the necessary standard. Furthermore, the trust had been administered in good faith by the late Duke, whose stewardship of the estate had included the provision of housing and support to Miss Voss for a period of 6 years at considerable personal expense to the family, a provision that demonstrated, he argued, not concealment but generosity. He said the word generosity the same way Lady Ashford said it. Alina noticed that. Mr. Caro rose. He was, Alina had come to understand, the opposite of Mr. Forsyth in almost every way quieter, smaller, entirely without performance. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are confident the words will do the work, without requiring additional assistance from his posture or his voice. He produced the trust documentation, the grandmother's will, the original letter from Mr. Finch to Gerald Voss, which Mr. Holt had found in the files and which stated, with uncomfortable clarity, that the trust conditions had been met and that release of the funds was pending family review, a review that had apparently been pending for 26 years. He produced the birth record. He produced the marriage certificate, Catherine Ashford to Gerald Voss, 1802, witnessed and registered and entirely legal. He produced 3 letters from the late Duke's personal correspondence, letters that Mr. Holt, in his 31 years of filing, had kept copies of, because he had been a man who understood that documentation had a way of becoming important when people assumed it had been destroyed. The letters were not incriminating in the way of confession. They were incriminating in the way of pattern, the late Duke writing to the senior partner about the Voss matter, the Voss trust, the advisability of maintaining the current administrative arrangement, the importance of ensuring that the matter remained, in his word, settled. Mr. Forsyth objected to their admissibility. The judge admitted them. Eleanor sat through 4 hours of proceedings with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed and her attention absolute, tracking every argument, every counter, every citation, the way she had tracked things for 6 years in the margins of law books at a kitchen table. Beside her, Edward was still. Not the stillness of disengagement. She knew his stillness well enough by now to read it. This was the stillness of someone paying very close attention and managing, with considerable effort, a response to what he was hearing that he did not wish to produce in a public room. At one point, Mr. Forsyth characterized Eleanor's mother's marriage as a regrettable departure from family expectations that had placed an unfortunate burden on the estate. He used the word unfortunate 3 times. He used the word burden twice. Eleanor felt Edward go very still beside her. She put her hand briefly on the table between them, not touching him, just present. A small signal. He exhaled slowly and did not move. The judge took 40 minutes. Eleanor spent those 40 minutes in a small anteroom with Mr. Carroll, who reviewed his notes with the calm of a man who had done what he could do and was now in the territory of outcomes. Edward stood by the window. He had brought coffee from somewhere, 2 cups, which he had handed to Eleanor and Mr. Carroll without comment, keeping none for himself. Eleanor drank hers. "Whatever happens, Mr. Carroll said, at some point in the 40 minutes, the documentation is in the record now. If the decision today is not in your favor, we appeal. The foundation is solid." "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you." He nodded and went back to his notes. Edward was still at the window. Eleanor looked at him, his profile, the gray March light coming through the glass, the left arm held at its angle. "Edward," she said. He turned. "Thank you for coming," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "That night. In the kitchen." "You heard all of it," she said. "I said I would," he said. She looked at him. There was, she thought, something in the way Edward Ashford said he would do a thing and then did it, the complete absence of theater around it. No announcement, no visible effort. That was the most dangerous thing about him. It was the thing that had made the kitchen impossible to leave. The thing that had made him impossible to keep at the careful distance she had intended. She had intended a great deal of things over 6 years that had not survived contact with 11 o'clock and firelight, and a man who asked what she was reading, and then actually listened to the answer. She looked away from him. Mr. Carew was called back into the courtroom. The judge's decision was 17 minutes long. Eleanor would remember almost none of the words. They blurred into the formal language of legal finding, citations and precedents, and the careful grammatical architecture of a conclusion. What she heard through it were the shapes of things. The trust was valid. The conditions of release had been met. The documentation demonstrated a pattern of administrative delay inconsistent with good faith management. The property in the West Riding was to be transferred to Eleanor Margaret Voss as the legal heir of Catherine Ashford Voss within 60 days. Mr. Forsyth requested an appeal. The judge noted the request and denied it. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the March air was cold, and the sky was the particular white of a day that had not decided whether to be overcast or clear, and had settled on both simultaneously. Eleanor stood at the top of the steps and looked at Leeds, the streets, the buildings, the ordinary busy afternoon of a city entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside the gray stone building behind her, and felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that felt, she thought, like standing up straight after years of carrying something heavy and discovering that your spine still remembered how. Edward came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately. They stood together looking at the street, and the cold air moved between them, and somewhere below a cart horse stamped its feet against the cobblestones. 80 acres, he said finally. In a dower house, she said. In the West Riding. Yes. Have you seen it? Not yet, she said. I intend to. He nodded. I'd like to come, he said. When you go. If you'd allow it. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the street below, not at her, which she understood by now was the way Edward said things he meant most seriously. Looking away, so the words could exist in the air between them without the additional weight of his eyes. Why, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Because it's yours, he said. And I'd like to see the things that are yours. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The city moved around them. A woman walked past with a child on each hand. A vendor on the corner below called something to a passerby. The horse stamped again. All right, she said. They were met at Ashford Manor by Mrs. Pratt, who opened the door with her usual composure and the additional quality, Eleanor noted, of a woman who had been waiting to see how this day had resolved and was relieved by whatever she saw in their faces. Lady Ashford was in the upstairs sitting room. She did not come down. Harriet came flying down the main staircase approximately 30 seconds after Eleanor crossed the threshold, which meant she had been watching from the upper landing, and she grabbed both of Eleanor's hands and said, "Tell me everything," with the wholehearted urgency of someone for whom other people's consequential days are experienced almost physically. Eleanor told her the essential facts. Harriet burst into tears, the happy kind, which Harriet produced with the same ease and lack of self-consciousness as every other emotion she had. She hugged Eleanor again, longer this time, and Eleanor, who had not been hugged by anyone in 6 years, stood in the entrance hall of Ashford Manor and let it happen. Over Harriet's shoulder, she saw Edward watching from the foot of the stairs. He looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere and was not entirely sure of the protocol for acknowledging it. She looked at him. He looked back. Harriet pulled away, wiping her face with her sleeve in a way Lady Ashford would have found appalling, and said, "What happens now?" "Now," Eleanor said, I have a great deal to organize." She did not go to the kitchen that night. She went instead to the library, because there were things to write, plans to begin, the practical machinery of a new situation to set in motion. She had written to Mr. Carew. She had written to Mr. Holt. She had begun a list of what would need to happen, and when, and in what order. The property would need to be assessed. The survey was 15 years old. The tenants would need to be introduced to their new landlord. The dower house would need inspection. There were accounts to open, arrangements to make, the entire complicated practical architecture of a woman who had had nothing and now had something, and needed to understand precisely and completely what that something was. She was in the middle of this when the door opened. Edward came in. He looked at the papers spread across the library table, the lists, the letters, the notes in her small, precise handwriting, and he looked at her. And then he crossed the room and sat down across from her in the chair that had always been, technically, available to anyone. He didn't ask what she was working on. He could see what she was working on. He pulled one of the blank sheets toward him and picked up the pen she wasn't using. "Tell me about the tenants," he said. "What do you know so far?" She looked at him. "Edward, you've been managing this alone for 6 years," he said, not looking up from the paper. "You don't have to anymore. Tell me about the tenants." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she found the relevant page in her notebook and began to read. They worked until well past midnight. Lady Ashford came to Eleanor's room the following morning. Eleanor opened the door and stepped back, and Lady Ashford came in and stood in the center of the small room, looking at it briefly, as though she was seeing it for the first time, which Eleanor suspected she was. The room was very small. The lamp was inadequate. The view from the window was the side of the garden wall. Lady Ashford looked at these things with an expression that Eleanor had not seen on her face before, and could not entirely name. Then she looked at Eleanor. "I want to be clear," she said, "that I intend to maintain my position regarding the administration of the trust." "That is your right," Eleanor said. "And I want to be clear that what happened, the arrangement, was my husband's decision, not mine." Eleanor waited. "That doesn't," Lady Ashford stopped. Something moved through her face, and she brought it back under control with visible effort. "That doesn't excuse what you experienced here. I understand that." It was, Eleanor thought, the closest Lady Ashford was capable of coming to an apology. Not close enough, perhaps, for some people. Possibly as close as she would ever get for this one. "I know it was his decision," Eleanor said. "I also know that you continued it." Lady Ashford looked at her. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did." "What will you do now?" Lady Ashford said. "I'm going to see my property," Eleanor said. "And then I'm going to decide." Lady Ashford nodded once, the small, precise nod of a woman who has understood something she would have preferred not to. She left. Eleanor stood in her small room with the inadequate lamp and the view of the garden wall, and felt, for the first time, that she was standing in it by choice. They went to the West Riding on a Thursday. Edward rode. Eleanor took the small Ashford carriage, the practical one, not the formal one, and they traveled the 40 miles in the particular companionable manner they had developed, which involved very little ceremony and a great deal of looking at the landscape, and the occasional exchange of observation that might or might not lead somewhere, and neither of them was under any pressure to resolve. The property was more than Eleanor had expected. Not larger, the 80 acres were 80 acres, modest and working and unpretentious. But the land was good. She could see that immediately, the fields properly maintained, the drainage functional, the tenants' cottages in reasonable repair. The farm itself was operational. Someone had been taking care of it. She would learn, later, that the tenant family had been on the land for 3 generations and had maintained it with the stubborn competence of people who understood that the land's quality was their own. The dower house was small and stone-built and had been empty for some years, which showed in the dusty windows and the ivy that had been allowed to make decisions about the east wall. But the structure was sound. The rooms were good-sized. The kitchen had a hearth large enough to be genuinely useful. Alina stood in the main room and looked at it. Edward stood behind her, slightly to the left, where he tended to position himself when he was looking at something she was looking at, not beside her exactly, but close enough that she was aware of him, which she suspected he was aware of her being aware of, and neither of them had addressed this directly. "It needs work," he said. "Yes," she said. "The east wall first. The ivy has been at the pointing." "Yes." "The kitchen is good." "Yes," she said. "The kitchen is very good." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "If you were to stay here." "I am going to stay here," she said. "Then you would need." "I know what I need," she said. "I've been making the list for a week." Alina, she turned around. He was closer than she had realized. The room was not large, and they had both been looking at the same thing, and the distance between them was considerably less than was strictly appropriate for 2 people who had not had a particular conversation yet. He looked at her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what to say. For some time. I have been trying to find a version of it that is not." He stopped. "That doesn't." "Edward," she said. "I am aware," he said, "that the timing is. I am aware that you have only just." "Edward," he stopped. She looked at him. This man who had sat across from her in a kitchen for weeks and brought a second candle, and asked what she was reading and actually listened, and left the light burning when she didn't come, and who had come to Leeds without being asked, and stood beside her through 4 hours of proceedings, and said, "I'd like to see the things that are yours," without looking at her, because some words need air and not eyes. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "I don't want you to go to the West Riding," he said. "Or I do. This is yours and you should have it. But I don't want you to go to it alone." "And I." He reached out and took her hand carefully, as though checking first whether it was something she would permit, and when she didn't move, holding it with the steady, unglamorous certainty of a man who has finally said the thing he meant. "I would very much like," he said, "to have the right to follow you here." Alina looked at their hands. "That," she said, "is a very lawyerly way to propose." Something broke open in his face, a smile she had seen only in fragments before, in firelight, in unguarded moments. She saw the whole of it now. "I've been spending too much time in the kitchen," he said. "Yes," she said. "You have." She looked up at him. "Ask me properly," she said. He did. She said yes. Outside, the West Riding stretched in every direction. The long, particular light of a Yorkshire afternoon falling across 80 acres of good working land, across fields that had been managed and maintained by people who understood that the quality of the land was something worth protecting, across a stone house that needed its east wall attended to, and its windows cleaned, and its ivy persuaded back to a more reasonable position. It was, Alina thought, exactly enough. It was, she thought, considerably more than she had been given. She intended to make the most of both. 1 year later. The east wall of the dower house had been repaired in September, the ivy cut back to something that could reasonably be called decorative rather than structural. The windows had been cleaned in October. The kitchen hearth, which had turned out to be even better than it first appeared once the chimney was properly swept, had been in daily use since November. It was now March. Alina stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the West Riding in the early morning light, the fields beginning to show the first uncertain green of a season that had not quite committed to itself yet, the tenant cottages with their wisps of morning smoke, the long stone wall along the eastern boundary that she had walked twice now and intended to walk again when the ground dried out. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Edward came into the kitchen in the unhurried way he moved in the mornings, coat not yet on, collar open, the left arm held somewhat better than it had been a year ago, which the doctor attributed to rest, and Alina attributed to the fact that he had stopped pretending it didn't hurt. He came to stand beside her at the window and looked at the fields. "Frost tonight," he said. "Possibly," she said. "Mr. Hartley thinks not." Mr. Hartley was wrong about the frost in January. Mr. Hartley was wrong about the frost in January, she agreed. He reached past her for the coffee pot with the easy familiarity of a man entirely at home in a kitchen, which Edward Ashford was, she had discovered, in a way that had surprised approximately everyone except Alina and Mrs. Hobbs, who had simply nodded when told, as though this confirmed something she had already worked out. He poured his coffee. He stood beside her at the window. The morning light moved across the fields. The wedding had been in June. Small Alina's choice, and Edward had deferred to it without argument, which she had noted and appreciated. The Ashford Chapel, a dozen people, Harriet crying from the moment the ceremony began and continuing at intervals throughout the breakfast afterward, with the cheerful lack of self-consciousness that was entirely and completely Harriet. Lady Cecily had sent a letter. A good one, warm in the precise, unsentimental way that Lady Cecily was warm, wishing them well and noting, in a postscript, that she had found a very satisfactory arrangement of her own with a gentleman in Derbyshire who had, she wrote, the considerable virtue of having suggested it himself rather than having it suggested to him by their respective mothers. Alina had read that postscript twice and smiled. Lady Ashford had attended the wedding. She had sat in the front pew on Edward's side, and she had worn gray silk, and she had not cried. And at the breakfast she had spoken to Alina, briefly, correctly, with the stiff and genuine effort of a woman attempting something she found difficult and had decided, for reasons Alina suspected had as much to do with Edward as with anything else, to attempt anyway. It was not warmth. Alina did not expect warmth. But it was presence. It was the choice to be there, in a gray silk dress, at a wedding she had not wanted, and to speak to the woman she had placed in a kitchen for 6 years as though that woman was now, officially and irrevocably, her daughter-in-law. Alina had accepted it for what it was. She was learning that year the difference between what she wanted and what was possible, and the particular quiet satisfaction of finding that the possible was often, when you looked at it honestly, enough. They divided their time between the West Riding and the Ashford estate, an arrangement that had been Edward's suggestion and Alina's modification, because Alina had wanted it clear, from the beginning, that the West Riding was not a country retreat but a working property with working tenants whose landlord they were, and that being their landlord was not a title she intended to hold at a comfortable distance. She had met every tenant family in the first month. She had learned their names and the names of their children and the particular difficulties of each parcel of land and the history of the agreements her grandmother had established, which turned out to be fair and sensible agreements that had simply been allowed to become outdated. She updated them. She did this with Mr. Carol's assistance and Edward's input and the careful documentation she had been trained by 6 years of necessity to produce. And when it was done, she had a set of agreements she could stand behind, and tenants who understood without ambiguity who they were dealing with. Edward had watched this process with the expression she had come to know as his paying close attention expression, which looked, to the uninformed observer, like stillness, but which she had learned to read as the opposite. "You're going to be better at this than I am," he had said one evening, reviewing her notes. "Different," she had said. "Not better. Better," he had said, and gone back to the notes. She had not argued. She was learning, also, the particular satisfaction of being known accurately by a person who had no interest in flattering you and every interest in telling you the truth. Harriet had come to stay for a fortnight in February. She had arrived with too much luggage, and a new piece of music she was determined to master, and opinions about the East bedroom wallpaper that she delivered with the cheerful conviction of someone who considers interior decoration a matter of moral importance. Eleanor had listened to all of it. She had also, at some point in the fortnight, found herself sitting with Harriet at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon, coffee between them, the February light gray and flat through the window, and realized with a small and genuine surprise that she was enjoying herself. Not performing enjoyment. Not managing the situation. Simply sitting in a kitchen with someone, talking, in the comfortable disorganized way that Harriet talked, and finding it entirely pleasant. She had thought about this afterward. She had decided that 6 years of careful self-containment was a reasonable response to 6 years of circumstances that had required it, and that she was not obligated to maintain the containment now that the circumstances had changed, and that Harriet Ashford was, underneath the noise and the luggage and the opinions about wallpaper, a person who was entirely without malice and rather good company. She had invited her back for April. Harriet had said yes before Eleanor finished the sentence. The Ashford estate, in their absence, was managed by Edward Stewart, a competent man who had been underutilized for years and was responding to actual authority with visible relief. Lady Ashford remained at the manor. She had, in Eleanor's absence, taken on the management of the household accounts with an efficiency that suggested she had always been capable of it and had simply been waiting for a reason. Eleanor had noted this without comment. Edward had said, "She needs something to do." She always has. Eleanor had thought about this and decided it was probably true, and that a person could simultaneously have caused a great deal of harm and be genuinely miserable without a purpose, and that these two things did not cancel each other out but could coexist, which was one of the more uncomfortable lessons the year had offered, and also, she thought, one of the more important ones. She did not visit the manor more than necessary. But when she did, she sat at the dining room table. She sat at the dining room table with Edward on one side and Harriet on the other, and Lady Ashford at the head, and she ate the food that was served upstairs, and she looked at the room, the portraits, the silver, the long windows with their view of the garden, and she felt, not triumph exactly, but a kind of settled acknowledgement. She had been here all along. She had simply been made to forget it. She did not forget any more. On Sunday mornings at the West Riding, they came down to the kitchen together. This had begun without discussion. The first Sunday after they arrived, Edward had simply come downstairs before Eleanor did, and had the fire going by the time she appeared, and she had come in and he had handed her coffee, and they had sat at the kitchen table with the morning coming through the windows and the fields outside beginning their slow transformation from winter to something else. It had happened the next Sunday. And the next. It was their kitchen, now not a kitchen she had been relegated to, Not a kitchen she had survived in, but a kitchen she had chosen in a house that was hers, with a man beside her who had asked for the right to follow her here and had meant it in every particular sense. She had kept the table from the Leeds market, small, wooden, pushed against the wall, exactly like the one at Ashford Manor. Edward had raised an eyebrow at it when the cart delivered it. "We have a perfectly good table in the dining room," he had said. "I know," she had said. He had looked at it for a moment. "All right," he had said, and had said nothing else about it. This morning, the first Sunday of March, exactly 1 year from the courthouse steps, they stood together at the kitchen window and drank their coffee and watched the West Riding consider whether to commit to spring. "We should look at the north fence this week," Edward said. Hartley said the posts on the upper section are going. "I'll go tomorrow," Eleanor said. "You have the meeting with the steward." "I can move the meeting." "You've moved it twice." "Go to the meeting." "I'll take Hartley and we'll assess it properly and have something useful to tell you by dinner." "You're going to tell me it needs entirely replacing," he said. "It needs entirely replacing," she said. "I've thought so for a month." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same territory. "All right," he said. The morning light shifted, clouds moving somewhere above the gray-white sky, and a brief, watery brightness moving across the fields as though the season was testing something, seeing how it felt. Eleanor looked at it. She thought about the kitchen at Ashford Manor, the small table, the single candle, the law books under the stairs. She thought about 6 years of eating alone in a room she had not been sent to so much as drifted into, staying because leaving would have cost her the one thing she needed to protect. She had protected it. She thought about the courthouse steps and the cold March air and the horse stamping on the cobblestones below, and Edward looking at the street instead of at her, and saying, "I'd like to see the things that are yours." She thought about this kitchen, this window, this particular quality of West Riding morning light that she had been looking at for a year now, and had not yet finished finding interesting. Edward's hand came to rest briefly on the small of her back, the light, habitual contact of a man entirely comfortable in his own kitchen, with his own wife, on a Sunday morning with nothing requiring performance from either of them. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. They stood like that and watched the fields. "Frost," Edward said. "No frost," Eleanor said. "We'll see," he said. "We will," she agreed. Outside, the West Riding light moved slowly across the land that had always been hers, across the fields, across the stone wall, across the 80 acres of good Yorkshire earth that her grandmother had set aside for a daughter who had chosen badly and loved completely, and died at 23 without knowing what she'd left behind. She knew now. Eleanor set her coffee cup down on the small wooden table pushed against the kitchen wall, the table that was hers, in the kitchen that was hers, in the house that had always, technically and legally and without any valid dispute, been hers, and she thought. She never forgot the kitchen chair. She just made sure she'd never be sent back to it. If you stayed until the end, you felt it. Some stories don't end, they linger. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.